I do rise today, Madam President, to urge the Senate to pass legislation to prevent the IRS from trampling on free speech rights, particularly those of 501c4 organizations. The Stop Targeting of Political Beliefs by the IRS Act, that's a mouthful, I know, is sponsored by Senator Roberts from Kansas and myself. It would prohibit for 1 year the finalization of a proposed IRS regulation that would specifically limit the advocacy and educational activities of these groups. This bill would also prevent additional targeting of 501c4 organizations by restoring the IRS standards and definitions that were in place before the agency started targeting conservative groups back in 2010. Last spring, we learned that the IRS was targeting conservative groups applying for 501c4 tax-exempt status, thanks to a report by the agency's Inspector General. Since this discovery, several IRS employees, including the acting commissioner, have resigned. Investigations by the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the Department of Justice are ongoing. Nevertheless, on November 29th, the IRS published a proposed rule that would restrict the activities of 501c3 organizations, limit their speech, and curtail their civic participation. This rule singles out the same groups that were previously targeted by the IRS and threatens to limit their participation in a host of advocacy and educational activities, even nonpartisan voter registration and education drives. These activities have a clear role in promoting civic engagement and social welfare, which is the precise purpose that 501c3 organizations are structured for. Unfortunately, this proposed rule would suppress these organizations' voices by forcing them to quit these activities or be shut down. While this administration may be focused on quieting its conservative critics, even liberal groups have denounced the rule and called attention to the detrimental impact on free speech of organizations of all ideologies. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, this rule, quote, will produce the same structural issues at the IRS that led to the use of inappropriate criteria in the selection of various charitable and social welfare groups for undue scrutiny. In response to the Obama administration's claim that the tax-exempt applications for these groups have, coincidentally, become confusing in the aftermath of the Citizens United decision, Nan Aran of the Alliance for Justice Action Campaign has commented that 501c4 organizations, quote, weren't invented in the last election cycle. They've been around for generations. Their purpose isn't to hide donors, it's to advance policies. Even the Sierra Club has hammered the IRS rule. As of this morning, I believe it's at least 94,000 comments. The Minority Leader mentioned it may be north of 100,000 now on the proposed rule have been submitted. This marks the largest number of comments ever submitted to any rulemaking. Let me repeat that. This is the largest number of comments ever submitted to any rulemaking. As I said before, to put it in perspective, the Keystone Pipeline, the proposed rule there, we've heard so much about, has registered just over 7,000 comments. That's compared to somewhere near 100,000 comments here. Clearly, the public sees through this administration's veiled attempt to squash free speech and to shut down opposition to its priorities. Yesterday, the House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed this same legislation, identical legislation in the House, by a vote of 243 to 176. Already, this legislation here in the Senate has 40 Senate co-sponsors. It clearly deserves the consideration and support of the full Senate. However, this legislation has not been permitted to come up for debate in the full Senate. Earlier today, Democrats on the Judiciary Committee voted to oppose it, stalling further consideration. I suppose that the veto threat issued by the President may have had something to do with that. This veto threat is unfortunate. It's clearly disproportionate, a disproportionate response to legislation aimed at protecting the free speech rights of conservatives and liberals alike. This bill is simple. It only suspends new IRS rulemaking related to 501c4s until the ongoing investigations are completed. Simply suspends for a year That is prudent and necessary. I urge my colleagues to join me in support of free speech rights by these groups by approving this legislation to prevent the finalization of the IRS's rule or any other that seeks to continue to target groups based on ideology. And so with that, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Finance Committee be discharged from further consideration of S. 2011, that the bill be read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be laid on the table.
I would object at this time to the unanimous consent request, and I yield the floor.
Objection is heard.
If I could, I'd like to just respond to a few of these items. The gentleman is correct. This correctly falls under the Finance Committee's jurisdiction, and that's part of the reason why I'm bringing this forward. The Finance Committee is undergoing an investigation that is not yet complete, and so I think it would be prudent to forestall the implementation of new rules at the IRS while the Finance Committee is still having its investigation going on. I think that we all agree that we shouldn't move forward on imprecise or incomplete information. That's why we're simply saying we're not proposing a rule. We're saying simply delay the new rule until investigations can be completed. Also, with regard to the issue of fairness, I should note that this applies to 501c4 organizations, a nonprofit organization. There are other organizations that are also nonprofit, but are not included in this proposed rulemaking. For example, labor unions. They operate under a nonprofit status as well, I think 501c5. They're not included here. And so the gentleman correctly says that we should be concerned about fairness for all groups that are under this kind of nonprofit umbrella. And that's concerning to a lot of people as well, is because those organized under 501c4 status are targeted here when those organized under C5 status are not, when they have some of the same restrictions on what they can do. So we'd be imposing new rulemaking and new rules on some organizations and not others. And so that's one concern, and another reason to forestall new rulemaking until we have more complete information about what's going on at the IRS. And with that, I would yield back and thank the President.